Well, all right, friends, as I alluded to a couple of times, we are going to start a new series from the book of Revelation. So I'm just interested to know how many of you have ever kind of plumbed the depths of the book of Revelation? How many of you have at least read it? All right, a few of you, right? How many of you understand all of the symbolism and all of the futuristic events that are in that book, right? Yep, some of you are just like, yep, absolutely, okay? All right, I don't even claim to come close to that, right? Revelation can be a very daunting book sometimes with the amount of symbolism that is in it or some of the interpretations that come with it. And honestly, I don't think since I've been here as your pastor, we've really spent a lot of time looking at what God has to say through this book. And so I thought, what a better time than right now to spend time looking at how Jesus talks to some actual churches of the first or second century and what he tells them that they need to do. And so today I'm going to invite you to just have an open mind about this, to really truly allow God to speak to you, because one of the things that the book of Revelation can do, despite all of the supernatural events and things that are in there, is that it can be a very practical book. There can be some very practical wisdom that we can use to apply to our personal lives, but also to the lives of our church, okay? And so again, the purpose of this series is really for us as a church to examine each one of the 7 churches in the book of Revelation, see what Jesus speaks to them, and for us to say, okay, we're doing these things that Jesus has called us to do, but there also may be some problems along the way, right? And as you'll see as we go through this series, almost all of the churches, Jesus gives them a compliment and says, look, church, you're doing this really well, but this is where you're struggling. Okay, these are the things you need to fix. And so I think one of the things that's insightful for us is, again, as a church, to say, okay, are we doing these things? What are the lessons that we can glean from each and every one of these churches? Now, I'm going to warn you that today is going to be a little context heavy, and I need to provide that information just so you understand sort of the backdrop and what's going on in some of this. And so please forgive sort of the historical nature of some of this stuff, but I think it's important in our understanding of this. So to start off with, the book of Revelation is written by a man named John. Church tradition often credits this to the Apostle John. Many modern scholars disagree with that, think that it's a different John, a different pastor or prophet that was in that area. Just for the sake of things today, we're just going to consider that we'll go with church tradition and just say that it is the Apostle John. And he's writing from this tiny little island out in the sea called Patmos, where he's been exiled because of some of his teaching and his espousing of Christian values. Now, the original audience of his letter were 7 churches that were on the mainland in Asia Minor, and today that is the modern country of Turkey. I've got a map for you to see those locations. I'll show that to you in just a minute. Now, the other piece of this is that this piece of literature, this book, is written in what's often called an apocalyptic style, okay? And so we see a lot of really supernatural things, right? There's a lot of symbolism, there's weird creatures, there's angels, there's beasts, there's dragons, and there's also these prophetic events or these very large-scale battles, all right? And many times I think this is why people struggle with the book of Revelation, is because our modern minds just are not used to sort of dealing with some of these aspects of this type of literature. And yet, friends, for the ancient people, there was a lot of this, and this was very commonplace for them, okay? Now, again, if we deal with apocalyptic stuff in our modern day age, most of it's not very fun to deal with, right? If you ever watch a post-apocalyptic movie, it's pretty darn depressing, right? You generally sit for 2 to 3 hours watching this poor guy try to survive after some nuclear holocaust, only to find out that he dies at the end of the movie, okay? And you're like, really? I just spent 2 to 3 hours to watch that? All right? But that's not the way this is. And in many ways, what we're going to see is that the book of Revelation, whoops, go back one slide for me. really means to reveal or to unveil. And so what John does here is, in some ways, he kind of pulls this curtain back on what we might call the supernatural realm. And he says, look and see what's inside of this. And so, again, he does give us this glimpse of the glorified Christ. He gives us a glimpse of some of the things that this glorified Jesus tells him to write down or to share with these people, okay? And so some of the things, there's three kind of areas to this. The first are the things that are seen, right? And Jesus says, look, these are the things that you will see. And in chapter 1, I'll read that to you in just a minute, John actually sees a vision of the glorified Christ. He literally sees this, and he shares it to the best that he can in this creative and artistic style. There are things that are, right? And so especially when we deal with the seven churches, there's seven real places in this time and space that you're writing to. And again, there are some more futuristic elements to this where John says, look, there are things that will happen after these things come to pass, right? Now, many times we struggle with this latter part, and sometimes even our own Christian and brothers have not been very helpful in this, because anytime somebody tries to predict the second coming of Christ, we generally get into trouble, right? How many times have people said, well, on this date, and whether it's 2000 or 2012 or whatever date it is, this is the day that Jesus is going to return. Well, whenever we try to do that, we get ourselves into a lot of trouble and create a lot of confusion. So we need a little bit of faith to say, okay, Jesus told us these things. We can believe that Jesus will do what he says, but even Jesus says in the scriptures, I don't know the time and the place that the Father has in store for all of these things to happen. The other thing, in the midst of all of this symbolism and in some of the creatures and supernatural elements that are present within this book, one of the things that we always need to remain focused on is the fact that what is revealed is the glorified Christ. It's what Jesus is going to do, or what Jesus is doing, or what Jesus is going to do, okay? It's not so much to get wrapped up in some of the dualistic nature of this or some of the big things, but rather to see God's care for his people, God's care for his creation, and to see how he's revealed in these events. All right, there is that map that I spoke to you of, and many of the churches before you are all on the western coast of Turkey. And today we're going to spend some time looking at the Church of Ephesus, which is the most westernly and a little bit south there, if you can read that map, okay? Now, this is just an artistic representation, and again, there's a lot of symbolism in there, and in order to understand this picture and even to begin to understand the message to the seven churches, we have to understand who's giving the message. All right, and so if you were to go back and you were to read Revelation chapter 1, verses 9 through 20, here, again, John is sitting exiled on this island when all of a sudden he hears this voice behind him, and he turns around to see who it is, and in this vision, he sees the glorified Christ, okay? And I'll even read you a couple verses. It says, so I turned around to see the voice that was speaking, and I turned and saw 7 golden lampstands. And among the lampstands was someone like the Son of Man, dressed in a robe reaching down to his feet with a golden sash around his chest. The hair on his head was white like wool, as white as snow, and his eyes were like blazing fire. His feet were like bronze glowing in a furnace, and his voice was like the sound of rushing waters. In his right hand he held 7 stars, and coming out of his mouth was a sharp double-edged sword. His face was like the sun, shining in all brilliance. Okay? And so this is sort of the picture that this artist is representing here, again, of this glorified Christ. And in his hands, he holds 7 stars. And the 7 stars, we later learn, just a few verses later, are the 7 angels or the 7 messengers of the church. Many scholars believe these are the pastors of the 7 churches. Okay? And so Jesus is speaking or giving a message directly to these messengers that he has for them. The lampstands that he is walking around represent the 7 churches. Okay? And interestingly, and in this, I think there's a unique symbolism in the fact that Jesus demonstrates an authority in these churches, right? He also shows his care and love for the churches, saying, look, church, I know exactly what's going on in each and every one of your circumstances. And in some places, you're doing a really good job, but in other places, you got a lot of work to do, and you're going to be in big trouble if you don't make some changes really quick, all right? And so it's just kind of a unique picture there for us to think about Jesus' role in the church. All right, last bit of context, and then we'll go in. So we're going to look at the Church of Ephesus today. That's the first letter that we find in chapter 2. Now, Ephesus was a major port city of Asia Minor. It also became the Roman capital of that area for a while. Ephesus was a major religious hub. It hosted the temple of Artemis or Diana, and for you history buffs, that was one of the 7 ancient wonders of the world, and so this brought a lot of people to this place, and it also probably represented a fair amount of religious pluralism, right? This idea that we'll try to infuse Greco-Roman religion into this area. Now, interestingly enough, despite all of the sort of cultural, economic, and religious hub that Ephesus is, it also maintains a very strong church. And this is a church that Paul spent time in, Apollos spent time in, Timothy spent time in, and probably even John spent time ministering and pastoring these churches. So it has a very rich and strong tradition of teachers within it. All right, friends, well, let's go and let's look at the first few verses this morning in chapter 2. And so Jesus says, okay, John, write these things. And to the church at Ephesus, write, these are the words of him who holds the 7 stars in his right hand and walks among the 7 golden lampstands. I know your deeds. You work hard in your perseverance. I know that you cannot tolerate wicked people and that you have tested those who claim to be apostles but are not, and have found them false. You have persevered and even endured hardships in my name and have not grown weary. All right? So Jesus offers this very rich compliment or series of compliments to the church at Ephesus and says, look, folks, you're a really hard-working group of people. You're not just kind of sitting back and letting life happen to you. No, you're going out, you're doing ministry out there, you're working hard, you're sharing the gospel, and you're doing really good things. You also have this sense of perseverance that no matter what rises up against you, you're able to move through it. It's not always easy, but you're able to move through it. You're able to bear up under this load. The other thing that I think is a very high compliment for them is that Jesus says, look, you're very good at discerning the truth, right? And for you, truth and doctrinal purity is a really big value for you. You've paid attention to the pastors and the speakers that have come in, and you've discerned whether their messages are good or bad, and the ones that are not on point, you've gotten rid of, right? And even if you go back to the book of Acts and look in chapter 20, Paul warns the church at Ephesus of this very thing and says, look, as soon as I leave, you're going to have to be weary of these false teachers that will come in and like wolves in sheep's clothing will gobble up my people if you're not careful, so you have to be on guard. And so obviously they took Paul's word for this, and they've preserved this value. Now, friends, I want to talk about this issue because it's important from the sense that when a church loses the ability to uphold truth and doctrinal purity, bad things start to happen. All right? And so one of the churches that I'm aware of, I had someone a while ago come up to me and say, you know, Josh, I've been going to this church for a while, and something just seems off. Something has changed within this church, and I just don't feel right about what's going on. And it got to be like almost every week this person would kind of call me and talk with me, and they would give me the message. They even encouraged me to go listen to some of the sermons that were there, and I was just kind of like, yeah, something just doesn't seem right about what's going on. And eventually, in time, we found that indeed that this pastor had kind of gone off the rails, that he'd kind of stopped operating from scriptural truth and just started to veer off in a certain direction, and it nearly destroyed the church, right? It ripped it apart because of some of the teachings that were going on. And so, friends, again, I think it's very important and a high compliment to this church that they're able to discern when speakers and pastors come in that they're being obedient to the truth found within the Scriptures. And so, friends, I give you that permission, even when it comes to me, that again, sometimes I make mistakes, and you guys need to be discerning in the things that I say and hold me accountable as your pastor, right? To make sure that I'm not going off in Josh's direction, but that we're staying on point. And so, again, if you have questions, come, ask, let's have conversations. All right? So Jesus gives them this high list of compliments, and then he goes on, but he says, look, I have this against you. And friends, this is a major, what we can call complaint, but he says, look, you have forsaken the love that you had at first. Now, friends, pay really close attention to that word forsaken, because what does the word forsaken mean? It means to abandon or depart from, right? This isn't just something that they've lost and they can't find, right? It's not like they started out and say, you know what, we're a really loving church. We really love God and love other people, but now all of a sudden the next day we woke up and we just punted love out the window, right? That's not the way that it happened. So I sense here in this scripture that something has happened, that again, there's been a movement away, and sometimes I suspect it's generally a slow fade, right? Or a backsliding that happens here, because it's, again, to receive it and say, look, you've lost the love that you once had, the love that you first knew. All right? Think of, if you will, go back in time for some of you. Think about that time that you were first dating, right? And think of how excited you were to be in that relationship, right? No matter what that person did, they could never do anything wrong, right? If that partner's sitting there chewing with their mouth open and making a whole bunch of noise, and you're just like, oh, that's so sweet, you're so beautiful. Girls would laugh at the guy's lame jokes and all of these things, right? Well, guess what? You get engaged and you get a few years of marriage under your belt, and then pretty soon that person that's chewing with their mouth open and making all that noise, you're just like, that's the most annoying and disgusting thing I've ever seen, right? Like, close your mouth, straighten up. The ladies no longer laugh at the stupid dad jokes that come out. They just think, really, can't you grow up? And then, guys, they don't tell their wives how beautiful they look or how excited they're to be with them, right? There's this slow fade, and Jesus says, look, that love that you once had at the beginning is now gone. And friends, think about that for the church. Think of what that means in a relationship with God. Does it mean that their relationship with God, that the love that was first there is gone, right? That maybe they've got so wrapped up in doing all of these things and working so hard that they forgot the true love of God. Now, friends, you've heard me say a couple of times that I think the COVID pandemic that has hit us has been a blessing and a curse for the church. And by a blessing, I take it to mean this very thing, that for some of us, even within these churches that I serve, there were some ministries that were going on that no longer had the love that had first started them. We had people trying to hold ministries up by the skin of their teeth going, just please don't fall, okay? I'm doing this all by myself. And not that those ministries were bad, not that there's anything wrong with them. They were good ministries, but maybe the time had come and we were spending so much time working so hard to keep them afloat, and COVID came and caused us to pull back and say, look, we really need to evaluate if these ministries are serving us. And it caused us to begin to look and say, look, what are our people passionate about doing? Where's the love that needs to come back? And so I feel like God has kind of moved us around and said, look, we need to go back to that first love. We need to refigure out what the church's purpose is and what the church is passionate about doing. What kind of missions and ministry work are we interested in being a part of? All right? Now, on the other hand, it's also been a curse, because sometimes if people have finally gotten out of the life sentence of some of these ministries, they haven't been very excited about signing back up and being part of stuff, right? And for some people, we've even seen them leave the church. Not that they're hostile towards the church, it's just that all of a sudden life kind of went back to normal, and they kind of moved away and said, you know what, well, I'd rather sleep in the morning, or I'd rather go watch my kids play sports, or I'd rather just go have breakfast with my friends, and so I don't even come to church anymore. All right, so in that sense, we've got some work to do, right? And we need to get those people back and say, look, you got to remember your first love, your love of God, to be in relationship with God, to be in community with each other, and then to go shine the light and the love of God within our communities. Now, Jesus also in this instance gives us this sort of way out. He says, okay, look, you guys got a major problem. And if you don't fix this, I'm going to remove the lampstand that I have here. All right, and friends, that's a pretty dangerous statement, right? And we see churches close all of the time, right? Because they fail to do the work that Christ has called them to do, right? We see churches that were once bustling and full, filled to capacity, that are now empty. And you say, well, yeah, Pastor Josh, but that's just the cycle, right? Things go up and down, and some things start. Well, again, friends, most organizations don't cease to exist if they're still in love with what they're doing, right? Maybe there's a rare occasion where that happens, but again, if you're sharing the gospel, if you're inviting people to be in community, into church, if you're going out sharing the love of God, ministering to those people that are in need, again, the church probably shouldn't be in too much danger of closing its doors, okay? So he says, look, there's three things, 3 R's that you can do to get back on the right track, okay? He says the first one is that you need to remember the love that you had before, all right? So think about that time when this church first started. Remember how in love with me you were. Remember how you couldn't wait to go out into the community and share the gospel message with people. Think of how excited you were to come together and worship together, to be in community together. Friends, we just finished a story on the prodigal son, and what was the healing, the beginning of the healing process or the conversion process of the younger son? It was that remembering of what he had back at the father's house, and saying, why in the world am I sitting here trying to eat out of a pig trough when I could be back at the father's house, right? It's that remembering. To go back to some of the examples that I've given you, again, what does it look like to remember the way that relationship used to be? To remember when you were really excited to be together, to spend those moments together. Now, I'm not talking about some superficial high, right? Some emotional high that we just simply can't maintain forever, right? We hope our love matures and grows, and yes, it looks a little bit different, but things change when we remember the joy that we had at being with that person in the beginning. Second, we need to repent. And friends, repentance is sometimes not a real easy thing, and it's definitely not a superficial thing. It's just not something we come and we say, you know what, I'm sorry. I'm not going to do that again, right? No, friends. Yes, it's coming and saying, I'm sorry. Yes, it's asking for forgiveness, but then there's action that follows it up. Action that says, you know what, I was going this way and I need to turn all the way back this way and go and walk back towards God. I need to go back and rekindle and do the things that I was called to do originally, which is this last point, which is to go out and to repeat those very things. To go back and say, you know what, we've moved away from these things. And even though we're really hard at work, we need to go back to those things that we used to do. All right? Or at least in the intention and the nature that we used to do them. Now, friends, think about that in terms of a relationship. Again, is it going to be awkward if you and your spouse, or you and your significant other, or you and a friend have created distance in your life? Is it going to sound really awkward when you begin to compliment them and affirm them and treat them in a different way than you have the last however many months or years? Yeah, it's going to feel weird. And at first, you're probably going to think, wow, I don't know that this is making any difference. I sit there and tell my wife how beautiful she is, and she just kind of still rolls her eyes at me. All right? But friends, guess what? Eventually, there's going to be a change. Eventually, I truly believe that if you're doing that, not just in order to receive, but your intention is to truly love on that person, to be back and operate out of that way, that person will eventually respond, and you'll be able to shorten that distance and grow back together. All right? And so, friends, again, as we think about that as a church, do we need to take some of those steps? Have we forgotten some of our first loves? And if so, let's go through these steps so that we can remain a thriving and valuable church to our people and to this community. Now, verse 6 is a little bit cryptic, but he says, friends, you have this in favor, that you hate the practices of the Nicolaitans, which I also hate. Okay? Many scholars can't figure out exactly or precisely who the Nicolaitans are. Many of them believe that they just simply might be a group of false teachers, or a group of sort of what we might call pagan teachers that tried to blend Greco-Roman religion with Christian religion, all right? And so there was this sort of attempt to fuse the two together. And God says, I really don't like that, and you've done a good job of doing that. And so, friends, I think that in itself serves as another meaningful example of what we're called to do, right? And even as we look at the state of our own denomination and the challenges that we're facing within the denomination right now, we're caught in some of the same things that this church is, right? Like, we're called to this doctrinal purity, right? We're called to the truth. But if we wield it like a cudgel and we keep the doors shut because we say, look, this is our hard line in the sand and we don't want any part of anybody who doesn't believe in that, well, guess what? We failed to operate out of love, and that's not what Christ would do. And Christ then, I think, would call us into some of the same conflict that he had with the religious leaders of his own time, saying, look, you're to share God's love. You're allowed people to come in and find their way to move towards God, and yet you guys are preventing them. And so, friends, truth is important, but we need to be acting and operating with truth out of love, right? And I think we also can see the danger, too, of the exact opposite side, that sometimes we can strive for unity and harmony at the expense of truthful teachings, right? And so, friends, we have to work through the tension of those two things and find out exactly where we are. Where are those places that we uphold truth, that we draw those lines, but also how do we make sure that our doors are open, because our goal is for people to come and be in relationship with God, right? And because someone does something different or has a lifestyle that's different than what we think, the doors of the church still need to be open for them to come in and to move toward God, to allow God to work in their lives and in our lives as well. So, friends, let me leave you with a couple of action steps this morning. The first one is for us to assess, does Christ's complaint to the church at Ephesus apply to us, both as individuals and as churches? That is, have we forgotten our first love? Okay? So I encourage you to do that as an individual and to be in discussion here in our church about this. Secondly, as a practical one, implement the 3 R's this week. Again, remember those things in your past. Again, if it's a relationship issue, remember those good times. If you're at work and you no longer feel passionate about the work you're doing, well, guess what? Rekindle some of that. Remember why you're there. Remember the contribution and the impact you're having on people's lives because of that. Spend time in repentance, moving back towards God for places that you have moved away. And finally, go back and repeat those things that you used to do. God bless you guys.